Hi, it's Jo, and this is my video on the Menendez brothers and whether or not I think they were telling the truth. Now, I did spend a lot of time researching this one. I've watched all the court proceedings. I watched the Netflix series, which you probably have too, but we know that's a bit of fiction, based on a true story. But I know that the brothers themselves are arguing some of the facts in that. Nevertheless, I'm not going to provide you a long history or background into the Menendez brothers because I'm sure you already know their story. And if you don't, plenty of stuff on the internet, and watch the Netflix series. I think it was really well done. I'm going to jump straight on in and tell you whether or not I, after watching a lot of video and drawing on my professional experience as a forensic trained clinical psychologist, and just my own opinion, whether or not I think they are telling the truth. Then I'll show you a couple of snippets of some of the observations I made, some of the work I did in the background to form that conclusion. So let's get in. Do I think they were telling the truth about the abuse? Absolutely. Yes, I do. But I do not believe them about their motive. Well, hold on. Let me be careful here because I believe the ultimate motive was undoubtedly the abuse of the father and the neglect of the mother. But I do not believe when they claim that they acted out of imminent fear. They said that they acted out of imminent fear for their lives. They thought their parents were plotting to murder them. The evidence just does not seem to support that. Yes, they were fearful. They absolutely were fearful. They lived lives of fear. They were very familiar with the sort of fear that living with those parents caused. But I believe that it wasn't fear, imminent fear, that motivated them. I just think that they had no other way out. They believed they had no other way out. Always turn your phone off when you're making YouTube videos. Okay, so I think they believed they had no way out and therefore they plotted to kill their parents. Remember, Jose, their father, was a very powerful man and he could manipulate a lot of people. He had money, he had influence, and he'd also abuse these boys. And it's not just sexual and physical abuse, it's mental abuse. It's poisoning their minds from a very young age. So I do believe that they just took it into their own hands and they decided that this was their way out. And why do I think that? Well, they bought guns 2 days before they planned to kill their parents. They organised to meet with a friend to cover their whereabouts. They shot their parents in the knees to make it look like what they said a mafia hit. And even when I watched them in the stands, there was just a lot of leaking of body language around questions pertaining to motives. There were increased blink rates. There was self-soothing behaviours, a lot of touching of the self. There was also a lot of anxious behaviours and deceptive eyeball movements. Someone is really trying to contact me. I'm going to put my phone somewhere else. In the Dr. Grande video that he did, granted it was about 5 years ago, but he talks about new evidence being introduced post-sentencing in the way of a letter that was supporting the abuse. He talks about the trial not being fair, primarily because of the therapy tapes that were included. Nevertheless, he says it was an unfair trial. And he acknowledges that he believes the brothers were being abused. And yet, after that, he still thinks that justice was served. He says that if the boys were given manslaughter, they probably would have spent 22 years in prison. And he does say, in fairness, he sort of is unsure about whether manslaughter or first-degree murder, life in prison, would have been the better outcome. But he does ultimately conclude that first-degree murder was the right outcome, mainly because the boys killed their mother. And he cannot understand what the mother did wrong. For some reason, Dr. Grande concludes the mother posed no threat and they had no reason to be enraged with her. He says the boys shot her in the knee and then reloaded to finish the job, and he calls this particularly heinous. But just the mechanisms of the murder tell me that there's a lot of hatred towards the mother, a lot of anger. Let's just have a look at this. Let's just go and have a look at this.
But what danger did the mother pose? Right? They shot the mother and she wasn't killed, and they went and reloaded and then shot her again.
What danger did the mother pose? A mother's duty is to protect her children. Her inaction posed so much danger, so much damage. Sometimes doing nothing is doing something wrong. Dr. Grande argues that the mother did nothing wrong, but doing nothing is the something wrong. And in a way, that's complicity. You know, if she knew that this was happening, then she is complicit, and in my mind, that's just as guilty. Erik actually said something really interesting. Now, don't quote me, but he said he felt betrayed because for a long time, he didn't tell her. He thought he was doing the right thing and was protecting her by not telling her what was happening to him. But then he says, and now she tells me she knew. So Erik learns that his mother knew what was happening and did nothing. And this is where something changes, I believe. He has gone from a position of loving his mother, wanting to protect his mother, to being incredibly angry with his mother. And anger is really important in this case because I do believe it speaks to motive, and I'll come back to that later. It just reminded me, and I'm going to bring it up, of when Erik is in the courtroom and the counsel asks him about his mother, and you see this anger. You don't see sadness, you don't see regret, remorse, guilt, shame. You see anger.
She was real nasty after a relationship with Kirsten and I ended. And she would say, "What are you, gay? Or what are you not man enough for?"
You see his brows just here? That's anger. As he recalls his mother, as he thinks about his interactions with his mother, he feels anger.
For her, are you just not? You're just not a man enough person to be with her? Is this what your problem is?
And why was that, if you know?
It's because I didn't understand what was happening with my father.
What you see there is a different response. The conversation has now moved to the father, and his expression changes. The anger has gone. He closes his eyes and he looks down. This is like a blocking kind of response. This is overwhelming. It's too hard. Now, it's not anger, but that's not to say he's not angry with his father. But this is too much. So he shuts himself away, but very different from how he felt and how he responded when he was speaking about his mother. I'll put those next to each other so you can see the difference. In the second photo, his head is down. He's probably remembering the details, and he shuts down. He doesn't want to go there. A little later in the trial, we actually see what I believe is a moment of disassociation from Erik. Disassociation is a form of trauma response where you can't just sort of block it out anymore. Your brain literally turns off. People with PTSD probably are familiar with this, but what happens is the emotional brain and the thinking brain disconnect.
When you were 13 to 15 and the rough sex was happening, did you, based on things your father was doing, did you form some opinion about his experience in these matters?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Now, what you see there is some very obvious body language. You see him lean, he almost sways, touching his head, looking down. He's uncomfortable, and he looks back up. He makes direct eye contact with his counsel, and he says something that's really poignant. He looks at her and he says, "I didn't hear the first part of the question." I'll let you watch this again, and then we'll come back and talk about the importance of that one sentence.
When you were 13 to 15.
At this point, he's looking directly at his counsel and he is listening. He's paying attention.
And the rough sex was happening.
Okay, you see immediately there the impact of those two words. Erik quickly withdraws. He puts his head down. His hand comes up to his head, and he's shutting down at that point. Momentarily, but he shuts down. Incidentally, that's the first time we've seen that kind of body response, that behavioural posturing from Erik up until this point.
based on things your father was doing, did you form some opinion about his experience in these matters?
I didn't hear the first part of the question.
At the beginning, when he was asked about being 14 or 15, he's listening. Those two words are said, automatic shutdown. Nothing is processing. His emotional and his cognitive brain have disconnected momentarily, and then you see he's sort of shaking his head like he's coming to again. His eyes come back to the attention of his counsel, and he says, I didn't hear the question. He was literally unable to hear. He had stimulus overload, a trauma response. This is very, very hard to fake when you know what you're looking for. Normally, if someone's faking, you'll see exaggerated emotion. We don't see that. We see very subtle disassociation that's perhaps only visible to a trained eye.
So this video was meant to be just a short video about whether or not I believe the Menendez brothers were lying. But that conclusion wasn't made impulsively. It was made and drawn from weeks of research, most of which I videoed as I went along, at least to some extent. Obviously, I can't possibly show you all of the content. It would be too long. It would be too boring. If you have specific parts of the trial or behaviours that you'd like me to take a closer look at, let me know. I probably already have done it. But in conclusion, let's recap briefly. Do I believe the brothers were telling the truth about the abuse? Yes, I do. But I don't completely believe the motive as it was presented in court. I appreciate the defence is constrained by what constitutes a legal mitigating factor or motive, and self-defence would make sense given the years of abuse that Erik and Lyle experienced, but there just wasn't enough evidence for that. You see, the abuse itself would not be justification for them to take the law into their own hands and kill their parents, unless there was necessity in the example of defending their own lives. I can't condone violence. I can't say what they did was okay, but I can understand it in the context of their story. People might say, how could you kill your parents like that? I would say, how could you violate or betray your children like that? Jose and Kitty are not here to defend themselves, granted, but if I'm believing the brothers, as I say I am, then I guess I'm also assuming the guilt of the parents. You can't really have one without the other. No matter what position you come from, it's a tragic story, and I do not believe justice was served. I believe we need much more education and understanding about the impact of child abuse and developmental trauma. It really is a lifelong sentence for the child. So to punish these brothers with another lifelong sentence is not justice served, in my opinion. Abuse is not an excuse to kill, but it is a reason. It was their reason. And I wholeheartedly support the freedom and the release of Lyle and Erik Menendez.